Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise Fly podcast. I'm again joined by Nathan C.J. Hood to discuss Tolkien, at this time, Tom Bombadil, and the resignation of power. So, to tie into our last episode about the ring and power, the idea is that the ring can seduce even good characters. People like Boromir is seduced, and Aragorn and Gandalf and Galadriel have to work to avoid being seduced by the ring. So, but what makes Tom an interesting character is that he doesn't seem to be affected by the ring at all. And I think there's a brief portion from the Fellowship of the Ring that needs to be read that'll illustrate Tom's uniqueness. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment on his his big brown skinned hands. Then suddenly he put it to his eye and laughed. For a second, the hobbits has a vision of comical and alarming, of his bright blue eye gleaming through a circle of gold. Then Tom put the ring round the end of his little finger and held it up to the candlelight. For a moment, the hobbits noticed nothing strange about this. Then they gasped. There was no sign of Tom disappearing. Tom laughed again, and then he spun the ring in the air, and it vanished with a flash. Frodo gave a cry, and Tom leaned forward and handed it back to him with a smile. Frodo looked at it closely and rather suspiciously, like one who has lent a trinket to a juggler. It was the same ring, or looked the same, and weighed the same, for that ring had always seemed to Frodo to weigh strangely heavy in the hand. But something prompted him to make sure. He was perhaps a trifle annoyed with Tom for seeming to make so light of what even Gandalf thought so perilously important. He waited for an opportunity when the talk was going again, and Tom was telling an absurd story about badgers and their queer ways. Then he slipped the ring on. Merry turned towards him to say something and gave a start, and checked an exclamation. Frodo was delighted in a way. It was his own ring after all, for Merry was staring blankly at his chair and obviously could not see him. He got up and crept quietly away from the fireside towards the outer door. "Hey there," cried Tom, glancing towards him with a most seeing look in his shining eyes. "Hey, come, Frodo, there. Where be you going? Old Tom Bombadil's not as blind as that yet. Take off your gold ring. Your hand's more fair without it. Come back, leave your game, and sit down beside me. We must talk a while more and think about the morning. Tom must teach the right road and keep your feet from wandering." So the two important things here: one, the ring does not make Tom invisible, and two, Tom can see you while you wear the ring. In the Council of Elrond, Gandalf says, "No," said Gandalf, "not willingly. He might do so if all the free folk of the world begged him, but he would not understand the need. And if he were given the ring, he would soon forget it, or most likely throw it away. Such things have no hold on his mind. He would be most unsafe. He would be a most unsafe guardian, and that alone is answer enough." So we see here, even within the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf saying that, well, the ring has no power over Tom. And then, what does Tom Bombadil represent for Tolkien? Well, this is from his letter 144. Tom is not an important person to the narrative. I suppose he has some importance as a comment. I mean, I do not really write like that. He is just an invention. And he represents something that I feel important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. I would not, however, have left him in if he did not have some kind of function. I might put it this way. The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has a long lost any objective save mere power, and so on. But both sides, in some degree, conservative or destructive, want a measure of control. But if you have, as it were, taken a vow of poverty, renounce control, and take your delight in things for themselves without reference to yourself, watching, observing, and to some extent knowing, then the question of the rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you, and the means of power quite valueless. It is a natural pacifist view which always arises in the mind when there is a war. But the view of Rivendell seems to be that it is an excellent thing to have represented, but that there are in fact things with which it cannot cope, and upon its existence nonetheless depends. Ultimately, only the victory of the West will allow Tom Bombadil to continue or even to survive. Nothing would be left for him in the world of Sauron. So, from Tolkien's own words, the interesting thing here is there seems to be a distinction that Tolkien is making that is also made by George Orwell in his 1944 essay on nationalism. And on nationalism, Orwell criticizes what he calls pacifists, but by that he means the political kind that are generally anti-Western and pro-Eastern authoritarian states, and he excludes religious minorities and philosophical commitments. Tolkien seems to be an expression of the same attitude with regards to the sort of pacifist of conscience, Tom. And the other thing that's interesting is, unlike Lewis, who doesn't seem to have very many kind things to say, so for example, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in order to avoid a duel with Reapercheap, Eustace says, oh, he's a pacifist. He doesn't have to duel for honor. And then Lewis even wrote an essay to a pacifist society before World War II, Why I'm Not a Pacifist. Tolkien's position seems to be one that's been recently articulated by Bishop Barron, who said that, we might appreciate the pacifist for his moral commitment, but we wouldn't want everyone to be one. And that seems to be where Tolkien is coming from. So I think all of this sort of sets the stage for Tom Bombadil, Power, and Resignation.
I think that's an excellent summary. And just on that last point there, before we get into the particulars, because there's so much of what you said we could specifically look at, I do wonder if perhaps this is a distinction between Protestant and Catholics in terms of theology, because you mentioned Bishop Robert Barron has the same kind of idea as Tolkien with regards to pacifism. The notion that some people might be set apart for a holy cause to join a religious order, separate from the obligations of everybody else, is something which is alien to Protestantism, where everybody is kind of taken up in the holy. The ordinary is part of the holy, so therefore nobody has like distinct obligations. Whereas if you believe in something like monasticism, which both of these men did, then maybe you could see Tom as a kind of reflection of that in the work, that there is a space for those who aren't engaged in the mundane sphere, but purely in the sacred sphere. That might explain why Lewis doesn't seem to have that space. Although it's funny, because just thinking of That Hideous Strength, for example, which is about resistance to a dystopian regime, the Company of St. Anne's, the resistance group, don't engage in violence, or most of them don't. They're there to wait patiently on orders. So there is a kind of pacifist element to that group as well. Yeah.
Well, I think also, too, there needs to be made a distinction between the different kinds of Protestantism. So if we look at Europe, we see primarily the sort of state church, whether it's Lutherans in Sweden or Germany. Well, actually, in Germany, I think it's the Evangelical Union, which is a Reformed Lutheran hybrid. But we also have, like, say, Anglicanism in Great Britain. I don't know if Presbyterianism is still state-supported in Scotland, but it was at one point.
It is, yes.
Okay. And so then the point is, in North America, though, especially in the United States, you have a trend of disestablishment from the church and the state, which led to a variety of Protestant sects that were more amenable to this position. So, I mean, obviously the most famous ones that set root in the United States were the Amish and the Mennonites, but even the Pentecostals in their original formulation took this position. And even churches that were not, say, pacifistic in orientation per se, like the Baptists, tended to have a much more negative view of large wars in the first place. So that might be a difference between being state-supported and not being state-supported, because, I mean, you're not going to want to bite the hand that feeds you, and if that state collapses, it's not likely you're going to do much better.
Well, and just on that point then, Catholicism was not the state religion when Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings. So he himself is from a minority position within his own country. So that might lend some credence to what you're saying there.
The other thing that's interesting is the way Tolkien writes. It almost sounds like the Tao, because I've mentioned some comments about the Tao, but he says this about Tom. He says, but both sides in some degree, conservative or destructive, want a measure of control. But if you have, as it were, taken a vow of poverty, renounce control, and take your delight in things for themselves without reference to yourself, watching, observing, and to some extent knowing, then the question of rights and wrongs of power and control might become utterly meaningless to you. Now, in a lot of ways, that sounds like a very radically Christian New Testament take, but it also seems to have similarities with certain Eastern traditions, We can think of like Buddhism. We can think of like Jainism. The Vedic concept of ahimsa, which can either be translated as essentially not harming. So you got the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, or alternatively translated as nonviolence. And it seems that kind of insight is being not just referred to in a specific context with vow of poverty. He's clearly referring to the monks, but it's also sort of articulated in a perennial fashion that could find roots in other traditions.
Yeah, I think that's fair because, again, for Tolkien, he sees all mythology as pointing towards the gospel, or at least the truths within mythology pointing in that direction. So then he can draw upon all mythology, in essence, because it all has this perennial truth, as you're kind of suggesting. And that, I think, is in part why Bombadil is such an intriguing character, because you can't pin him down to one tradition or one archetype. I was trying to think earlier what were some of the influences. Well, there's definitely a Christ influence. You could make an Odin reference. You've just mentioned the Tao. Like, he seems to combine so many, and his very personality has that sort of character of larger than life. He incorporates so much in himself, and he because you could see him as somewhat superficial, as this bumbling, laughing figure who skips through the forest having a great time, who's a bit out of the politics of the world. But in a way, he seems so much more serious than many of the serious characters. You feel like you're actually dealing with something very deep and truly powerful, I think, in a way that something like the Barrow-wights, and maybe we'll get into this later. These beings were ancient kings. They're now spectral shadows of what they once were, but they're the hand of evil, I guess, closest to the Shire. Sauron's influence there, and they have no power in relation to Tom, and yet he doesn't seem like that sort of character, right, on this surface. But in reality, they are just mist compared to his real substance. So I think that's a really interesting point that you make about the perennial truth, because it seems he himself carries that weight of tradition in his character.
Well, when Frodo asks Goldberry, who is Tom, she says, he is. Which, when they ask who is Christ, he says, I am. So there does seem to be that sort of connection there. But so there's two instances in where Tom exercises power. Well, I guess you could say three. I read one of them, his power over the ring. And he has power over the ring by resigning power. Again, as Tolkien said in his letter, he resigned power, so that gave him power over the ring. But it's over Old Man Willow, who's strangling Merry and Pippin, and it's over the Barrow-wights. So Old Man Willow is basically natural. He's not intrinsically evil, not like a Barrow-wight or an orc or a troll. He's corrupted. And, Tom talks about the trees with rotten souls and hearts. And then the Barrow-wights are, essentially undead. They're shades. They're ghosts. They're not exactly like Nazgul, but they're the closest thing to a Nazgul you're going to get without being one. And I think what's interesting is that because of his nature, he has power. He has power over natural things. He calls back the horses that were scattered. So the ponies that the hobbits were riding when they were scattered under the Barrow-wight attack, he calls them back. And so he has power over natural living things. Then he has power over evil spirits, maybe not necessarily orcs, but like evil spirits. And so the nature of his power. So it's interesting, right? So he resigns power. He resigns himself from the cares of this world, which gives him power over the ring. It gives him power over nature, and it gives him power over evil spirits. And so it's interesting how Tolkien is establishing. But again, that's a very, I guess you could say Eastern way of viewing things, the idea that you gain something by giving it up. And of course, Christ talks about that too. You gain life by giving it up. And so it's almost like he is giving a nod to the fact that there is this underlying structure that, if you understand properly, is more powerful than all the armies and swords of Middle Earth in a degree, in a fashion. And that, but Tom is really the only person that seems to embody that in the story.
it might be worth commenting on the means of his power, because I think this ties in with what you're saying. He it's I well, it's through his voice, but not just speech, it's verse or a song that he sings. And he talks about when he goes to save Merry and Pippin from Old Man Willow the tree, he says, I know the tune for him. He sings him a song, and uh, the willow releases them. Later, when the Barrow-wights have trapped the hobbits in their tomb, uh, Frodo sings a song that will call Tom, and Tom comes at that point singing a song, and with his own song banishes the wights forevermore from that place. I think there's a number of levels we can actually talk about this. The first is within Middle Earth, the kind of world of Middle Earth. Song is the very thing which brings things into creation. We see this in the Ainul and Dale, that the Aina, the angelic spirits, kind of receive the symphony from the All Father, Iluvatar, and they sing into being the world, or a vision of the world, which is then brought into being by Iluvatar. So song seems to be very key. In the stories themselves, in the Silmarillion, we find, for example, Luthien as a great singer who's able to overcome Sauron, even Morgoth, through the power of her songs, and even persuade the Valar to release Beren from death due to the beauty of her song. So songs have power, and it's interesting how Bombadil talks about Old Man Willow singing his own song. His own evil actions are a kind of song and tune. If we wanted to kind of apply this more philosophically, when you look at some Aristotle, for example, Aristotle talks about music as motion, that it's movement in pitch and it's movement in rhythm. And in doing so, it imitates emotion and character, because our emotions, emotion, a kind of motion. They would have talked about passions rather than emotions, but it's the same sort of principle. So music imitates ideas and characters. And Pythagoras, going even earlier, sees this as intrinsic to the universe itself. So the movement of things generates music. So we could maybe see then that Tom's power is that when he sings, he's actually articulating something of the true reality of things through song. His songs reveal the true character of things. So with Old Man Willow, he essentially says, why are you doing this? You should be eating earth and drinking water. Go to sleep. You're not doing what you're meant to be. He restores him through the power of his song. So to me, that's quite an interesting idea Tolkien's playing with, is that we just think oftentimes in a purely materialistic way. But actually, if you started to see the world in terms of the musicality of it, it gives you a certain, not just knowledge of the thing, but through that knowledge, you're actually able to influence it, and you're seeing it for what it truly is.
Well, what's interesting too is you said Old Man Willow is singing his own song. That kind of makes him a minor Morgoth, because Morgoth and Elwendale sings his own song in rebellion to Uru. And so, but even in singing his own song, Uru was able to then use that to eventually lead to the second song of the Ainur at the end of the Middle Earth history, which is, not yet occurred, but what Tolkien is pointing to. And, this sort of gets back to something that I've mentioned before with the Tao, the soft overcomes the hard. Music tames the savage beast, right? Music overcomes something difficult and hard. And so we see that Tom uses music in that way, in a somewhat imaginative, magical way, because this is not a complete one-to-one correlation with our world to do so. But I think what's also interesting about Tom is Tom represents for Tolkien his own struggles with how to understand war, because he says ultimately only the victory of the West will allow Bombadil to continue or even to survive. Nothing would be left for him in the world of Sauron. Okay, but we also have in a couple other letters, but all big things planned in a big way feel like that to the toad under the harrow. Though on a general view, they do function and do their job, an ultimately evil job. For we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring, And we shall, it seems, succeed, but the penalty is, as you well know, to breed new Saurons and slowly turn men and elves into orcs. This is referring to World War II. And then he also says, the utter stupid waste of war, not only of material but moral and spiritual, is so staggering to those who have to endure it, and always was, despite the poets, and will be, despite the propagandists, not, of course, that it has not and will be necessary to face it in an evil world. And now we also have a question, or not a question, an excerpt from the Unfinished Tales, where there's an imagined dialogue between one of the kings of Numenor and his wife. I am in too great a doubt to rule, to prepare or let to be, to prepare for war, which is yet only guessed, train craftsmen and tillers in the midst of peace for blood spilling in battle, put iron in the hands of greedy captains who will love only conquest, and count the slain as their glory. Will they say to Ur, at least your enemies were among them? Or to fold hands while friends die unjustly? Let men live in blind peace until the ravisher is at the gate. What then will they do? Match naked hand against iron and die in vain? Or flee, leaving the cries of women behind? Will they say to Ur, at least I spilled no blood? So he seems to say that there doesn't seem to be a good option in either of these cases with what he mentions in the Unfinished Tales. And it's interesting that he says even if we win the Second World War, we'll just become a new Sauron, or a new mustache man today. And that's sort of what Hayek was getting at too in The Road to Serfdom. But I think it's interesting here, right? Because Tolkien seems to be missing something. He seems to think that if you don't fight evil with the sword, you're not doing anything. Especially from that little bit from the Unfinished Tales when he says, what then will we do? Match naked hand against iron and die in vain? And it's like, that's a common theme that we see with people who say that, well, what are you going to do? Nothing. And I mean, my answer to them in this regard is, what did Christ do? Nothing. And given that the eucatastrophe, as Tolkien says, is rooted in the real life eucatastrophe of the crucifixion and resurrection, I find this to be a riddle.
Yeah, I guess there's a number of ways you could kind of build off of that. I think the very plot of the Lord of the Rings is interesting in this regard because the victory doesn't come through military force, although that I guess preserves the nations until the end, but rather through the mercy of Frodo towards Gollum earlier in the story, choosing not to kill him, which in the end enables the destruction of the ring, because when Gollum takes it from Frodo and Mount Doom, he falls to his death and the ring is destroyed. It wouldn't have been destroyed without Gollum's presence there. So it's very much a story which sees forgiveness and mercy as critical to the victory. I do wonder on the other hand, though, in his world, that at this point there is not a concept of a resurrection or a characters who can promise that after death there is resurrection or restoration. I guess the elves have some kind of promise, right? For men, it's unclear what happens after death. In that context, then it would seem like folly to allow the destruction of your civilization. I pose it in that way. I wonder if because in one of the History of Middle Earth texts, I can't remember which volume, I'm afraid, but there is this suggestion that there will be an incarnate Eru at one point who will overcome death itself. So there seems to be an indication that one day there'll be a Christ-like figure in Middle Earth who will achieve this, and which maybe then would allow for that sort of trust. But at this point in the story itself, I'm not sure. But that is in one sense that's within the story itself. But the broader issue, I guess, is what you're talking about. In our world, is that the case too?
Right, because
yeah.
Tolkien, when he writes when he writes all of this stuff in Middle Earth, he's operating from a morality of this world. Okay, now yes, he's imposing it onto this fictional, well-crafted world, to be sure, But the questions that he's wrestling with are the questions that he was wrestling with in his own time. And so, given that there's a different set of assumptions involved for someone who professes Christianity specifically, I think that is a bit of a riddle.
I mean, to be fair, and there is a strong Christian tradition of permitting military action, right? And the, um, I'm thinking particularly in the Catholic tradition of just war theory that Augustine and Aquinas develop in various ways. Um, so I don't think it's necessarily like um, immediately obvious that he's wrong. I think different Christians take different views on this
Okay,
point.
let me real quickly
Mhm.
rephrase it. I maybe I didn't phrase the question correctly. The idea that Tolkien seems to think that if you're not fighting evil with the sword, you're not fighting evil at all, and you're doing nothing. That assumption seems obviously flawed because of the example of Christ and his own rendering of the eucatastrophe. That's the question. I don't see why he'd equate that
Mm.
with doing nothing.
Yeah, and I think his own story argues against that point for the things that we've already mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And so now one of the things that I think, while one of the strongest points of the Lord of the Rings is the fact that Tolkien, as a philosopher, as a historian, as a linguist, could craft this internally consistent world so that it rings true no matter what age you read it in. The one thing that I think that Tolkien does sort of do in the sense of quote unquote stacking the deck, so to speak, is that if you can write a story in a certain way where a certain course of action is ipso facto not going to work, and it's not going to work because of the constraints that you put on the story, which, I mean, again, that's how you tell stories. But see, if you do that, though, you can kind of prove what you want to prove in a way that's not giving full scope to the possibilities. So he says that, there's no way to defeat Sauron as a Satan type figure. Morgoth, of course, is the actual Satan figure. And he says that there's no way to defeat Sauron using the methods of Tom. But my point is, okay, well, let's go back to the eucatastrophe of the crucifixion. Isn't that exactly how Christ beat the devil?
Yeah, and I think well, I wonder if it's not for Tom to do, but maybe as I was alluding to, there is this suggestion that there will be um Iluvatar incarnate in the future of Middle Earth. I Christ, essentially, right? Because it's always vague. It's in some places it's meant to be pre-British history these events, right? So it could flow into real world history. In other places, it's a totally cut off secondary world. Um, but in that case, perhaps then that would challenge the narrative that's being told, and also, and I think this is something I've been learning to pick up on. Although it's said authoritatively, like these statements about, oh, Tom wouldn't do this or Tom wouldn't do that, at the end of the day, these are just the opinions of characters within the story at the Council of Elrond. So I think it's Galdor or Gador who says that Bombadil would be defeated by Sauron in the end, but that's like his conjecture. He doesn't know that. He's not Iluvatar. Gandalf doesn't actually say that. He just says he wouldn't care about it. But again, Gandalf is not an all-knowing character. We often assume that, and we often think, oh, well, he was at the beginning of creation. He must know a lot. Well, he does know a lot. But each of the Ainur are only given a part of the mind of Iluvatar. They don't actually receive the fullness of Iluvatar's knowledge. Even Morgoth, who has every part of his mind in some part, doesn't know everything. And so it could well be that Bombadil or a character like Bombadil in the future might be the means to salvation within this story. I think it's left open the possibility by the fact it's not a narrator telling us this. It's a character who may be very wise, but it is not definitive.
Yeah, no, that could very well be. The other element too is where the moral universe of Middle Earth is different than our own, and why I've raised some objections to it to being considered a Christian rather than a perennial work, is the idea of orcs, right? These are a group of intelligent and trolls that are just completely incorrigible. There's no salvation for orcs and trolls. There's no negotiating with orcs and trolls. They're just sort of like there to be destroyed, and intrinsically so. Now, within a Christian moral universe, the only group that comes close to that are the fallen angels. There's no second chance for them. But for all mankind, there is in theory a second chance, if only we would take it. Now, again, since Tolkien is a Catholic, he does believe in free will, so he would believe that offer is holding for all mankind. Not to get into the Reformed Catholic debate, but from his point of view, that's what he would assume. And so, I mean, yes, you can tell a story where there are these sort of physical intelligences that are essentially stand in for demons that can only be fought by destroying them, and that therefore you sort of have a built-in demand for a certain kind of story to tell, which again, all stories have to have limits. But then the question is, that's not really the reflection of an observation of this world. And now if you believe that this world is like that and you impose the orcs and trolls in Middle Earth as an expression of this world, I think that's not necessarily correct to do either. And I think so in part, this idea that Tom, now granted though, when he said that Tom could not, there'd be nothing left for Tom in the world of Sauron, that's Tolkien speaking qua Tolkien. And the question then is that I feel like he's sort of stacking the deck in his favor with things like orcs and trolls, because if you're going to make a sort of normative moral claim like that, you do kind of have to invent these characters that we don't actually have in our world. And the demons, those who are closest to us, closest to that in our world, are those that we do defeat with Tom's methods.
It's an interesting point. I do wonder if you could make a distinction, because I totally grant your point on people, that there are not these irredeemable people within the world comparable to orcs. The famous saying that the line of good and evil is within the human heart, and so on. I do wonder though if you could maybe say beyond demons also certain causes are irredeemably evil. And your channel has looked full-heartedly at the simulacra in our current context. I don't think that is something which, although many people will try to say it's redeemable, in reality, it's probably something that needs to be sent on the fire in many ways, right? So, could you see that as an instance of it's not a creature, right? But it's a reality which no compromise can be taken with. As soon as you compromise, you're letting darkness in.
Right. So orcishness is a system of thought and behavior that can be manifested in humans, and that, like with the orcs, there's no quarter given to that, and that we must stand up against that, and then in an attempt to defeat that, we then draw individual humans away. If that's what you're saying, then yeah, I agree. That's where we would find quote orcishness in our world.
And Tolkien even uses this kind, not well, I think maybe orcishness, but he definitely uses like the spirit of Mordor is in Britain at the moment, or you were referencing World War II. I think it was particularly the bombing of Dresden, where the RAF essentially bombed citizens, right? Not military targets, kind of in retaliation for what the Luftwaffe had been doing in Britain. But he saw this as the spirit of Mordor. But he doesn't say even the spirit of Mordor. He's just like, Mordor is here. So I think he sees it in that way too. Certain behaviors and actions as well, and the kind of spirit of them, the motivation of them, is irredeemable and needs to be fought unrelentingly.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Yeah, that's we would call that orcishness, I think. The other interesting thing is, so let's go back to this key distinction here. We've talked a lot about the sort of the trees, so to speak. Let's get to the forest. The idea is that Tom has this kind of power because he has renounced power. He's stepped above the cares and concerns of kingdoms and what we might call the mundane. Well, actually, though, it's kind of like more mundane, though, right? Because it's nature, it's just existence itself that he's concerned with. So, in what sense, in what sense can we give sort of an explanation philosophically for why that might be the case? Well, for any given mode of life you choose, there are going to be costs that are imposed on you by that mode of life, and the costs that you impose on others. So, one of the implicit things is Tom is not imposing costs on people. He's chosen a life where he's not, because in order to impose costs, you have to have power. If you don't have power, you can't impose costs because, frankly, no one will put up with it. And you're just going to have to, and that's in large part why people want power, so they can't impose costs on other people. Now, they might then justify those costs to say, well, it's for the greater good, or it's for this, or it's for that. But ultimately, what allows Tom to see beyond all of this is one, he rejects a way of life that imposed costs on others. And then two, he sort of eschews a way of life where you get caught up in the moment, right? So when you're making a sort of political decision, you get because with these political struggles, right? And so this is something Tolkien will be comment on in his letters in the real world. We get caught up in all these passions. The propaganda, as I mentioned earlier, will inflame us against one another. You're in a position of life where you're no longer being influenced by those things. So again, Tolkien is a Catholic. He's got Thomist influences. He has Augustinian influences. So for him, evil passions rather cloud our judgment. And so by taking this life of resignation, because when you're in the middle of competition for power, there are all these emotions and tensions that are being constantly put on you that you have to be aware of and engaged with. And if you step out of that, so I'll give you an example. In Henry V, Henry V, right before they charge into Harfleur, Shakespeare has him say something to the effect that, while being peaceful and mild is great in peacetime, you must become, as hard as lions and, be cruel and savage in war. And so it's like you're putting away this sort of like Christian morality, if you will, for peacetime, for this more, I guess you could say pagan morality for wartime. And Tom is just not making that decision. He's not getting involved in that. And then thirdly, the kinds of things that you have to have, the skills, opportunity cost, right? There's only so many hours in the day to do something. If you're busy politicking and planning and scheming, what are you not doing? Well, you're not stepping back and looking at the big picture. You're getting lost you're mistaking the forest for the trees. And so I think in those three senses, Tom is able through resignation to look beyond what's happening.
So I was looking up, I think, a really great quotation which supports what you were saying there. And it's from Goldberry, and it's when Frodo asks her, "Who is Tom?" And she replies that he is, as you have seen him, she said in answer to his look, he is the master of the wood, water, and hill. Then all this strange land belongs to him? No, indeed, she answered, and her smile faded. That would indeed be a burden, she added in a low voice, as if to herself. The trees and the grasses, and all things growing or living in the land, belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master. So I think in that quotation we see a number of the things that you were saying. It's a burden to be a ruler. It's wearisome, and it actually extorts a cost not just on those that you rule, but on yourself. It's something which we see in other characters like Theoden and Denethor in their own ways. the emptying which leadership requires, or has an effect on you. We also see the fact that in kind of Tom's domain, all things belong to themselves. He is not a sovereign over them. He is one creature and they are another creature. They all have their own kind of independent and free existence. And that's something we spoke about last time, how in Middle Earth, as Eru has created it, all creatures have freedom. And the great story, I suppose, is that of freedom triumphing over those who would seek to deny freedom, such as Sauron, the suppression of the will, whereas Eru allows for creatures to disobey, such as Morgoth or Sauron. But within that, there is conflict, right? There is conflict, and certainly in the poems, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, we see actually, like, there's a whole sequence where first he gets trapped by Old Man Willow himself. He gets sucked into the tree in the poem. And then later he gets trapped by badgers. You mentioned badgers earlier. He gets trapped by badgers. He then gets attacked by a Barrow-wight. But he has no fear of these things because he knows what they are, truly what they are, and it knows what song to sing to them. So there's a sense in because the natural instinct would be to fight these creatures with sword or whatever. So I think that quotation perfectly kind of brings out all three of your great points there.
Exactly. So we have Aiden Paladin in the chat, and she asks a question I think is interesting. If Tom were Uru or an avatar of Uru, that would explain his disinterest in the politics and conflicts that involve even the Ainur, as well as the Maiar. Now, I'll say this. First of all, being created by Uru does not necessarily mean you're going to be involved in this world. So one of the things that we see about the hobbits all the time is it's the hobbits are disinterested about what goes on in Middle-earth. And Frodo views that as one of the charming aspects about the hobbits, and why Frodo, Merry, Pippin, and Sam have to give that up in order to save it. Now, that's their own resignation of a sort. They have to give up this disinterested, resigned existence in order to save the Shire. Tolkien, I don't remember exactly where, but in some of the letters I've looked at, basically says that Tom is just he says in traditional myths and legends, there are always these characters that just sort of pop up that aren't really explained. They add to the mystery of the story. That's Tom. He's not going to give you an explanation for who Tom is. Tom is just one of those creatures you meet along the story that is unexplained. Now, if I had to give an explanation of who Tom was, I don't think Tom is a Valar. I don't think that's a good explanation. I think Tom is one of the Maiar spirits, and there's so many of them that we don't know all of them. I think that's within the philosophical metaphysical construct of Middle Earth, as we see in the Silmarillion. I think the best explanation is he's kind of a Maiar spirit. He's considered one of the oldest. The only argument against that is when Goldberry says he is. At that point, you might say that is an Uru reference. But again, Tolkien himself, at least on an exoteric level, is telling us, I don't have an answer for who Tom is because there isn't one.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, we hear he's also the eldest. He calls himself the eldest, right? But it's interesting because when he discusses what he knows, he goes right back to the very beginnings of the world, when the elves woke up. Essentially, he was there before then, so he's very ancient. But he never discusses like the Ainu and Dale. It's very much from the beginning of the world. I was here. So I think that's an interesting aspect. I do think though that even if he wasn't Eru, and I'm not sure if there's enough of a direct comparison. He definitely illustrates features of Eru quite powerfully. I think he's almost like a living symbol of who Eru is, or a type in some way. Because Well, like Eru, Tom allows freedom for other creatures. He deliberately limits himself because he is powerful enough to rule everything in that little place in the world, right? He can just sing and what he wants, and he could get beings to do his bidding. But he deliberately resigns that, and that's reflected in the fact he limits his own territory. He chooses certain borders. He's imposed on himself borders in the land. He won't go beyond them. Kind of like how Eru allows creatures to disobey his will. He's kind of imposed limits upon his own sovereignty to an extent. I think I think where the analogy for me breaks down between Eru and Tom is Eru to me isn't disinterested, and we see this in at least two ways. Certainly in the Lord of the Rings, the very idea that uh, Bilbo's and Frodo's finding of the ring was meant to be, and throughout we're told certain things are appointed. This idea seems to suggest that there is a providential level to all of this, that although there's free will, there's some higher power working through these free choices. That doesn't sound like disinterest to me. That sounds like there is a power that's interested. Moreover, in the Silmarillion and in certain kind of lost tales and so on, there's certain prophecies that, well, in the Silmarillion, Eru says, through Morgoth's evil, I will still bring my plan to fruition. And there's various prophecies that Eru will overturn many of the evils through the creation of elves and men and so on. So this to me doesn't sound like a disinterested character, but actually one that's fully invested in the future of Middle Earth. So I see parallels with Eru in Tom, but I also see a bit of a difference because I don't think Tom would have that sort of attitude to the world. He would throw the ring away, right? I don't think Eru's like that.
Right. The other thing too, the fact that he's the oldest, he calls himself the oldest. Treebeard is also called the oldest in Middle Earth. So, well, then who is actually the oldest, Treebeard or Tom? But what's interesting here, though, is as you mentioned, right? Tom is circumscribed by Arda. He doesn't seem to have much of an identity before Arda, because when we know that Treebeard is a physical creature, he's an Ent, and we know that the Ents were produced by Yavanna to protect the trees in the Silmarillion, and that he is the oldest of the Ents. So the issue then is, or at least the oldest living Ent. And so then the issue then is, well, being the oldest then in this context seems to be the oldest within the veil of Arda itself, because Sauron is older than both, because he was there from before Arda. So then again, we're not meant to have an answer. That I think is the takeaway from Tom. Tolkien's like, there's no answer. Just read, just enjoy the character and move on. So, but it's interesting too, because there's something else that we see with Resignation, that we see with Tom, is when we see this right now all around us, people are always busy bossing other people around, right? How often do we hear, well, the world would be a better place if only those people over there changed? Meanwhile, you yourself, you don't work on it all. And if you have any sort of authority over friends or family, you don't try to improve them either. In order to, quote, improve the other people over there, you're going to have power, because you're going to have to exert power over them to compel them to your will. Whereas you already have control over yourself, presumably, so you don't need any extra power. And so if you're in the midst of the power game, then in some sense you lose self-improvement, because rather than improving yourself, you're seeking to acquire more power to control other people. And so Tom, by totally washing his hands of that, is, you could argue, the most self-actualized character in Middle Earth. And as such, he can see everything as it is.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. There's nothing lacking in him. There's no place for him to kind of morally develop at this point in the story. He is fully realized in his wishes and wants. His values are set forth His demands are put into action, and he lives by this sort of self-imposed cycle that he goes through. There's a certain time that he's going down to pick water lilies for Goldberry. There's a certain time where he'll be here, and there's a certain time where he'll be there, and he goes with that season, with the seasons in that regard, the calendar. He is living that way, and it's all done with great joy. That's one of the great things about Bombadil when you see him. He he's he's got these rosy cheeks and a big laugh and grin, and he's just enjoying himself, even though he's like amidst all these threatening creatures who seek to catch him. And that's something that it's very interesting how Tolkien phrases this, right? Tom has never been caught, and in the poems of the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, this is the refrain and the main poem. Something tries to catch him, something tries to pin him down, and kill him essentially. And he breaks out quite easily with his song. Nothing, and I suppose if you wanted to kind of take a broader reading of that, so often when we seek to control something, it actually ends up controlling us in many ways. When we seek to put all of our identity into something else, or seek realization through something else, it can actually end up that we become a serf to it and we get caught to it. It becomes our master. Whereas Bombadil is not a serf to anything. He's not a slave to anything else. He is his own master.
So, by the way, what you're talking about and what I was talking about, people are who do this are reenacting Morgoth. How does Morgoth control Middle Earth? He infuses his essence into it. So he went from the strongest of all the Valar to eventually the weakest, because he spewed his essence out into everything else to control it. And so there was actually no self to cultivate after a certain point for Morgoth. It was just power for its own sake, which is what Tolkien mentioned in one of the letters I read earlier in the stream. And so we see that a lot of people are like mini Morgoths, impotent Morgoths. They try to like control other people, and they then expend all of this energy with nothing to show for it. And so they end up, wasting themselves away. Now, I also think that I don't know if Tolkien read Carlyle, but I think Tolkien could be the sort of for Tolkien, Tom Bombadil is the Carlylean hero of the priest. And this is a quotation from the section Priests and on Hero Worship. Doubtless it were finer could we go along always in the musical way, be tamed and taught by our poets, as the rude creatures were by Orpheus of old. Or failing this rhythmic musical way, how good were it if we could get so much as into the equable way. I mean, if peaceable priests reforming from day to day would suffice us. But that is not so. Even this latter has not yet been realized. I think this explains Tom.
Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Well, because see, Tom has power over everything, right? It says, be tamed and taught by your poets as the rude creatures were taught by the Orpheus of old. So Orpheus was a musician and a poet who tamed wild beasts. And so the idea is Tom can use his music to tame Old Man Willow. He can use his music to tame the Barrow-wights. He can use, his music to gain control over the horses, the ponies that run away. And so it's almost like he is that musical poet priest that Carlyle is talking about.
Yeah, I can see that. And if you wanted to go for an even older reference, I think if you look at Finnish mythology and the figure of Vanamoinen, who's he is a bard essentially, whose songs come from the deep knowledge of things. He sings of what he knows, is what he says, and his power comes through that. His songs can shape the world. Whereas Yukahainen, who's a younger bard, creates his own songs and is unable to. They just kind of collapse as dust almost. So I think Vanamoinen is very much Carlyle's priest, and I think as a consequence, you're right that Bombadil certainly seems to be that. And personally, because I've tried to find a link between Carlyle and Tolkien in the past. I can't find an explicit reference, but it seems to me that if you've read Carlyle and you read certain passages of Tolkien, it's almost unmistakable that they share the concept of hero worship or the admiration of the great man. It's inescapable in Tolkien's work, right? It almost gives us a way of experiencing that through fantasy.
Well, what's interesting too is if you look at the heroes in Middle Earth that fight Sauron and Saruman sword to sword, there's the common theme of doom. And we see doom most clearly with the ride of the Rohirrim under Éomer after Theoden is killed and he believes all is lost. That is until Aragorn sails in with his ships. Now, while Tolkien in his letters argued that might be a necessary action, it's a doomed action. But notice there's no doom for Tom.
Yeah, that's true. I think yeah, I think that's a fair point. But we have to be careful with the word doom because it means something quite specific in terms of Norse and Saxon mythology, weird, which is doom can be neutral, and it's more like fate. It can be negative, but it can also be just what's going to happen to you. But certainly in terms of Eomer, I think that's that would be the way to read it, as this is the end for us. Whereas Tom doesn't have that. And you could say there's a sense in which Tom, well, it's interesting because when Frodo says, did you come because I called you, when Old Man Willow's attacking Merry and Pippin, he says no. It wasn't anything that I planned, or certainly I didn't plan it. But he never says like, oh, so some other power providentially organized this. Now we might infer that because that seems to be the case in other places, but it's left kind of open. And Tom, there's no kind of sense of, oh, he's fated to something. The actual emphasis is on it's in his own power what he does. So both in the sense of kind of ultimate defeat and in the sense of fate, he doesn't seem, doom is never mentioned with reference to Tom.
Right, exactly. And I think what's also interesting too is because Middle Earth is a sort of, like you said, inspired by a lot of different traditions, the Kalevala, Saxon myths, obviously elements of scripture, elements of Greek myth. So a lot of especially the pre-Christian materials is you often have contending forces in a kind of a dialogue where there's an impasse, right? Most famously, we see this in Plato's dialogues with the idea of aporia, where there's an impasse. But we can even see this like the sort of mythic forces. So, for example, there's the perennial tension between knowledge and force, and we see this throughout various mythology. So in the Greek mythology, that's Athena versus Ares, right? Wisdom versus force. And we see this throughout other myths. And there's not necessarily, they're both powerful forces and they both contend with each other. But usually the author isn't there to say, well, this one decisively routs the other. This is the answer to the question. Well, no, what makes the scriptures different than these other traditions is they do attempt to give you clear, discrete answers. Middle Earth is not doing that. Middle Earth has more in common with those earlier pre-Christian works that have various contending influences and forces that are powerful, but that make somewhat different claims, and the reader has to then determine what the best reading is.
Yeah, it's not a kind of conceptual work, it's an ideas work. There's ideas underlying it. There's not a system, a clearly thought out system which is being kind of just represented. I do think though that there is one sense in which Resignation, which comes out in Tom, that we've kind of touched on, but we haven't gone into kind of full detail, which is almost what you could say the epistemological attitude towards other creatures. And if I may, Todd, I would like to just read a a couple of paragraphs from his essay on fairy stories. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Yeah, because I think it's super relevant, and it will come clear why it's relevant as it goes on. So this is in the section from his lecture on fairy stories: recovery, escape, and consolation. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clean our windows, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiars are the ones both most difficult to play fantastic tricks with, and most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their colour, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release, but not so thoroughly as a fairy story, a thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Gram cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stock, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. And actually fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones mainly, with simple or fundamental things, untouched by fantasy. But these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, trees and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. And I feel for Tolkien that Bombadil is the personification of this spirit, that he does not seek to possess any of the things in the wood, he allows them to be free. But more than that, there's a certain childlike wonder and appreciation for all things. You'll note that when he sings a song about something, he doesn't just say like, oh, the tree. It's like the green large tree. It's like its attributes interest him. Or when they're going to sit down for dinner, it's like, oh, there's cheese and there's scones and there's lovely milk to drink. It's he notices what's there and he appreciates it and enjoys just the objects and their different characters. And Tolkien, the contrast is with a character like Thorin, who's obsessed with the Arkenstone, or Fëanor and the Silmarils, or the effect of the ring is that the characters want to possess it for its own sake and make it their own rather than just appreciate it. That's why, in part, I think he's able to. It has no effect on him because he appreciates things for their own value rather than what they can afford to him.
Exactly, and also like you mentioned, the things that these dwarves, elves, and men lusted after were artifacts, things that were constructed, the Silmarils, the Arkenstone, the ring. Whereas the things that Tom loves are natural things; they're things produced without artifice.
Most definitely, and he Tolkien mentioned it there. You can love nature rather than become a slave. And I think there's another reference here, or I've kind of got a theory that I've not seen anywhere else, but I want to try it out on you, Todd, and we'll see what you think. So I'm going to read a little bit from The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, the poem, which actually predates The Lord of the Rings, but there's a lot of similarities. And it's towards the end of the poem, where throughout different creatures have tried to catch Tom to get him caught, and he's escaped them all thus far. Wise old Bombadil, he was a wary fellow. Bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow. None ever caught old Tom in upland or in dingle, walking the forest paths or by the withy windle, or out on the lily pools in boat upon the water. But one day Tom, he went and caught the river daughter, in green gown, flowing hair, sitting in the rushes, singing old water songs to birds upon the bushes. He caught her, held her fast. Water rats went scuttering, reeds hissed, herons cried, and her heart was fluttering. Said Tom Bombadil, "Here's my pretty maiden. You shall come home with me. The table is all laden. Yellow cream, honeycomb, white bread and butter, roses at the window sill, and peeping round the shutter. You shall come under hill, never mind your mother. In her deep weedy pool, there you'll find no lover." Old Tom Bombadil had a merry wedding, crowned all with buttercups, hat and feather shedding. His bride, with forget-me-nots and flag lilies for garlands, was robed all in silver green. He sang like a starling, hummed like a honeybee, lilted to the fiddle, clasping his river maid round her slender middle. Now, I raise this bit of poetry because it describes Tom as the lover of Goldberry. I mean, it's implied, right, in the story, but it's very clear there. And Goldberry is the daughter of the river, or the river woman, but it's also said daughter of the river, of the Withy Windle itself. And it seems to me that there's a suggestion that actually Tom's attitude springs from his love for her and through her for nature. You'll see throughout that, why was he on his way past Old Man Willow? It was to collect lilies to give to Goldberry. Later, when they go to the Barrow-wights and he defeats them, he sizes a jewel. There's a great hoard of gold there. The only thing he takes is a brooch, so he can give it to Goldberry because it will look beautiful on her. So this is clearly a key feature for him, that he wants to give her things and look after her and be her lover. And I wonder if this too is also, this could help to explain, on the one hand, his self-imposed boundaries, that he gives himself fully to Goldberry, so he's not going to involve himself in other things. He sets his boundaries to where he can do that fully. It also explains why he is able to resist the lure of power, because he's so totally in love with Goldberry that nothing else kind of tempts him. And we see this theme with other characters such as Beren and Luthien. Beren is willing to take on the quest of reclaiming a Silmaril for Thingol, Luthien's father, so that he can marry her. And he willingly gives up the Silmaril, which many people desire for its beauty, because he wants Luthien more than the Silmaril. So there's this theme of love overcoming the temptation to possessiveness. So I see this in Tom, and I wonder if this love for Goldberry narrative, which could be seen as a love for the world or for nature, is really key to Tom's character and his ability to resign himself from greater power. Sorry, that was a long.
No.
long
Well, I think you might be onto something, and there's another example of resigning the ring that I think will tie into this, and it's Sam, and this is from the Return of the King. His thought turned to the ring, but there was no comfort there, only dread and danger. No sooner had he come in sight of Mount Doom, burning far away, he was aware of a change in his burden. As it drew near the great furnaces where in the deeps of time it had been shaped and forged, the ring's power grew, and it became far more untamable, save by some mighty will. As Sam stood there, even though the ring was not on him, but hanging by its chain around his neck, he felt himself enlarged, as if he were robed in a huge distorted shadow of himself. A vast and ominous threat halted upon the walls of Mordor. He felt that he had from now on only two choices: to forbear the ring, though it would torment him, or to claim it and challenge the power that sat in the dark hold beyond the Valley of the Shadows. Already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocked to his call as he marched to the overthrow of Barad-dûr. And then all the clouds rolled away, and the white sun shone, and at his command the Vale of Gorgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring and claim it for his own, and all this could be. In that hour of trial, it was the love of his master that helped him most to hold him firm, but also deep down in him lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm, his own hands to use and not the hands of others to command. So I think that sort of proves your point. Now, it's in this case, it's not love of a woman or nature; it's a love for his master, but it's this love that allows him to forego the ring. And so I think there's a trend here of those who can overcome the temptation of the ring.
Yeah, that idea of love being so all-consuming that because desire is a kind of love, right? That's a very ancient idea. You see it in the Stoics, you see it in Augustine, and so what we love ultimately directs our actions, and temptation is essentially a pull to love something that maybe we shouldn't love. But in this case, a stronger love can overcome it. Notice also as well, though, and this really jumped out. Remember that Goldberry said it's a burden to rule or to have too much power. And there in that passage, Sam recognized it would be too great a burden for him to rule that size of land. What's appropriate to him is a garden, and in Tom's case, his dwelling is a house with a lovely garden. So there seems to I think that's a great connection you've made there, and I don't think it's an accident that the same ideas and language are used in both contexts.
Also, this ties into Shakespeare and Henry IV. Henry IV says, "Uneasy is the head that wears a crown."
Yeah.
So we see, but there's a lot of Shakespeare that gets sort of retrofitted into Middle Earth, so that's not a surprise. Like the Ents, of course, are from Macbeth. I kind of think we've explored all the elements of Tom that we set out to. Is there anything else you think we've left out?
Let me just see my notes here. Well, I guess what one aspect is, you know, you raised the question earlier of Christ overcoming evil through non-violent means, actually receiving violence into himself and overturning that, receiving all the worst that the devil and the world could do, and then rising to new life, and suggested that maybe through Tom's means it could have been achieved also. So I'd be interested to know. I mean, this is a totally imaginative exercise, and I'm putting you a bit on the spot here. But within the world of Middle Earth, if that was the case, how could you see Tom being able to do that? What?
Right. Well, I think the way Tolkien has constructed Middle Earth, that wouldn't work because of orcs and trolls. And that's why I sort of think Tolkien is creating the answer that he wants by certain constraints within the narrative that are imposed that you don't find in real life. Because yeah.
Well, if we took orcs and trolls out of it, that's for argument's sake, and because you've still got like Sauron, who is a good character gone evil. You have men who have gone good, who start out good, who fall. So all these fallen creatures rather than irredeemable creatures. In that sort of setting, could you see a way for Tom's way to succeed?
I think ultimately the way it would succeed is if Tom's way was normalized, then the ring would have power over no one. And so how would Sauron get it back? Or to put it another way, how are the men of the East and Numenor corrupted by the rings? Well, Sauron gave them rings. Sauron gave the 9 men, the Nazgul, rings. He gave them gifts and tried to corrupt them through wealth and power. Well, if like Tom, men were to give up power, were to give up all of this, Sauron would have no means of appealing to them. And if Sauron would have no means of appealing to them, then how would they win? Now, again, this is highly speculative, highly conjectural, but given that Tolkien later amended his original belief on the Blue Wizards, Alatar and Palando, he originally claimed they were failures. But then some of his last writings, which are included, I think, in the History of Middle-earth by Christopher Tolkien, he argued that they were successful because if the men of the East, primarily Harad and Khand, had become fully under Sauron's control, they would have outnumbered the free people so greatly, even in the Second Age, that a victory like Elendil and Isildur achieved would have been impossible at the Black Gates. Well, at no point do we read about a military insurrection going on. So when Frodo is in Mordor, we don't see any of the orcs saying, the boss is putting down a rebellion in Far Harad. No, there's no reference to that. So how is it that the Blue Wizards are getting these men of the East to stop collaborating with Sauron? I mean, if there's no reference to any insurrections or wars of, national liberation or something through guerrilla warfare, I think the way they're doing it is probably something like Tom.
Yeah, and I'm quite persuaded by that point in terms of maybe like indifference or neutrality being the kind of way that many of them took. I do think though that there is, and that this comes down to kind of theological anthropology, how possible that is, because I totally concede the point. If everybody got to a kind of Tom state and loved maybe a wife or their people or a friend more than the ring, they would be able to withstand it. The difficulty lies in that, I think in Tolkien's view, those temptations will never go away. That because he's taking the Christian idea of original sin, I think, and sees this as inherent in human life, that even with the Holy Spirit blesses you with the gift of sanctification, and your mind and heart start turning towards love for God rather than love for sin, that desire for sin still remains. And we see this in the writings of the Apostle Paul. I do that which I would not do. And I wonder if for Tolkien that if it's in his view, Tom's way would be ideal, but human nature prevents it.
Oh, that seems to be what Carlyle thought with the poet priest. But I think also, okay, well, we need to then ask the question, what is the end state in mind? So I don't know exactly what Tolkien's view of the end times was, but as a Catholic, the majority position is amillennialism, which is the idea that that we are now currently, quote unquote, living in the millennium. This goes back to Augustine. There will still be an Antichrist at the end of history. I mean, that was a theme throughout the Middle Ages. And that eventually Christ would just have to come and set things right. So I'm assuming Tolkien is in step with that, because I don't know its exact thoughts on the end of history. So obviously there's no final victory over evil in this life. The question really then becomes, what is the best way to fight evil as we deal with it currently? And while it's certainly true that, I think very few people will take that route of resignation and sanctification and so on, there's two things. One thing is, Christ talks about leavening the whole loaf. That's not just the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees, which is deceit and lies, but it's also the leaven of the church. The church can be a leaven for all of society. So it's not that everybody has to all become, this Tom figure. On a sort of like the privates, so to speak, can still be privates with their flaws. They're not going to be, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But if we imagine like, a strategy for waging peace, and the Joint Chiefs are all, Tom Bombadil types, that they would then be able to organize some sort of resistance to evil in a way consistent with that. But then I'd also like to flip it as well. If we want to fight evil with first of all, Tolkien admitted that in winning World War II, they were becoming the new Sauron, which is very few people at the time had that level of perception about the Allied cause. The fact that Tolkien had that puts him in one of the elite few thinkers of the time to actually see this. And then again, and then the other thing is Lewis and Tolkien both fought in the trenches in World War I. And I don't remember exactly their names, but I think there were some friends of Lewis, or was it? Yeah, Lewis, that were conscientious objectors that went to prison in World War I. And, those who went to prison were not responsible for the fall of the West in the trenches. So now, granted, Lewis and Tolkien were drafted; they didn't really have a choice. But nonetheless, they were not morally responsible for the death of the West, which that war led to a series of events that did lead to the death of the West. So do you actually even preserve what you're setting out to preserve? In the case of Tolkien and Lewis fighting in the First World War, they didn't.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I think though that they would both feel that you would. I guess the question is, okay, so ideally we do want people who are moving towards having a love which can overcome the desire for control, for possessiveness, and so on. But we need to have some kind of recognition that there will be times of falling. Just as there are no orcs in the world, just orcish systems, so there are no bombadils in the world, just bombadilic systems, maybe, or ethos or attitudes. Sure. That was bombadillo systems, maybe. But at the same time, like recognition, okay, we're not going to reach that point. So for Lewis, and I question this attitude in part, but he has this essay on defense of democracy, and he essentially says, well, I believe all men will fall when they get power, and I believe democracy is the system which gives the most restraint or gives the most kind of checks on that. Now, living in 2022, we might question that, right? But certainly in his own context, at least that was his logic for supporting it over a dictatorship of some kind. And so I see this also in Tolkien to a degree, that because all other creatures are not like Bombadil, even if we could try and move them towards that point, we still need to recognize and try to deal with the fact that all of them will fall at some point or another.
Well, okay, so right, as Christians, again, I guess not to open up the can of worms on the millennium, so that depends on if you're a post-millennial. But if you're a premillennial or amillennial, and amillennial is probably the most common of the three, amillennial Christian views of the end of the world and premillennial end of the world believe that everything will more or less get worse, and then Christ comes at the very end to fix it all. So ultimately, for whether you're a Catholic or a Lutheran or a Baptist or an Anabaptist, you're all committed to the fact that we're not going to actually win this fight in the here and now. It's going to be won at the end of history with Christ. So then the question is, well, what's our standard operating procedure? What's our SOP? And then the question that I'm bringing up is the very methods that these people seem to want to defend, even if they admit that, well, they're, as Tolkien says, war can be pointless. And as Lewis says, power corrupts. These are still things we need to have, we need to have a presence in it because of the way things are. But what I would want to argue, and I think, Tolkien does give us some tools to reframe it this way, whether he's realized he's given us these tools or not, is that those things, by the very nature of the constraints placed upon the one in those positions, is unable to achieve his stated goal necessarily because of the constraints placed upon
Hmm. I need to go away and think about that a bit more.
him. maybe that's our final thought.
Hmm.
But thanks again, Nathan. It's been always a pleasure. Is there anything you want to leave our audience with before we wrap this up?
Well, just on Bombadil, I think regardless of whether you accept the whole, going the full way with resignation or not, his attitude of not appropriating things mentally, seeing the beauty and just character of things, whether they're good or evil, whether they're kind or unkind, it says cruel or lovely. Actually, just you know, um, seeking to understand and appreciate is one of the greatest qualities, and I find it, for me, when in those brief moments where I'm able to attain it, it gives a level of peace in life. So I would encourage everybody to do that. But before we go, may I just shill something
No, go
quickly?
ahead. Be my guest.
Well, tomorrow, it's the second of a series that I've been doing on called English Restoration, and I will be joined by Rupert August and Daughter of Albion, and we're going to be discussing the legend of Robin Hood, and the history of it, the matter, but also then the kind of values of Robin Hood and what it stands for. And we're hoping to do one a month. So that's tomorrow at 7 p.m. GMT.
Great.
And thank you for having me on. It's always great to be here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. I'll just end with saying that with Tom, as far as who he is, Tolkien says we're not meant to know. So that's his official answer. That won't stop people from trying to find out, but that's from the man himself. And then two, Tom represents, like what we saw in these older pre-Christian works, various powerful entities and forces that make different claims and have different spheres. And we're not told which one is the right one per se. It's choices and paths and so on and so forth. So there's a certain ambiguity about Tom's role as this peacemaker, which is an extension of Tolkien's ambiguity about war itself. Coming from a Catholic Christian tradition, he sees the evils of it. He sees the preferability of being like a Tom, but then he thinks that, well, is that really practical? And so we see in the work of Middle Earth itself a reflection of his own ambiguous and decided feelings on the matter. So that's all for today, everybody. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.